want to just get started?
It is me, yes, thank you very much. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to session 6. Tonight we are going to be focusing on teaching time. As always, we are expecting a large number of attendees, and you can help with the bandwidth by keeping your camera and microphones off during the presentation. And we are asking that if you haven't had a chance, if you're able just to click the link that Jacqueline has posted in the chat, that allows you to register which local authority, or if you're a student, which university you're attending from, because we're asked to report back to local authorities on the number of attendants. So if you're able to do that, that just helps us to keep track of that. Just a quick reminder of the kind of accessibility that's available during the presentation tonight. So you should be able to navigate the slides yourself down at the bottom. You can also put the slides into full screen mode. You can click the 3 dots and click on that. You may want to turn on live captions. We know that sometimes people are listening as they travel home and things like that, so it may help you to have live captions on. And if you do want to speak, please use the chat. We are monitoring that as we go through today, and you can also put your hand up if you would like to come in and say something to the group. And just a little reminder that the session is being recorded tonight. And yep, somebody's asking if we could post the link again for the registration. We'll just get that in for you there.
Yep, I'll get that in.
That's great, thank you. Now, if you do want to ask a question, you can put it into the chat, or you might also want to post it anonymously on our car park. Normally we do during our sessions encourage people to kind of come in and put their hands up, but sometimes when there's a bigger audience, people don't want to do that. So if you are if you've got something you don't want to kind of interrupt the flow of the session, you can put it in on the Padlet. And again, Maria, Jacqueline and myself are monitoring that as we go through the presentation tonight, and we can kind of pop in anything that comes, any questions that come in there. So when we think about tonight, we thought just to kind of get you thinking, just to start you off, if you're able to take a moment to think about when you are teaching time, what are the current strengths that you feel that you have, and what are some of the challenges that you've come across? So I'm going to pause and give you a little moment just to note your thoughts into the chat. That's great. I can see a few coming through on the chat now. So challenges, teaching analogue when children are not secure with fractions, strengths using an analogue clock, it's quite an abstract concept, so it can mean different things to different people. Children not familiar with seeing an analogue clock, kind of making the links to life and work and how important learning time is. Challenges of 12-hour to 24-hour. So that's great. Lots of things in there. And as we go through the presentation tonight, we are hoping to address some of kind of what we class as the kind of most common challenges that we come across when we're thinking about teaching time. So we thought it would be important just to start off thinking, why is time challenging, and why can learners find it challenging? And I think we know that it definitely is one of those areas that learners can find quite challenging to grasp, but it is really important, as we've said throughout the sessions, that we think about the language that we use when we talk to children. So we're not saying things like, oh, I know it's hard to learn time, but we are really trying to instill that positive mindset around maths. We don't want them to kind of make that link that, oh, this is our talking about time, oh, it's going to be really difficult. We're making sure that we are talking about it in that positive way at all times. So some of the points that people have made, these are not just relevant as learners start their journey at early level, but they are relevant right the way across as learners go into first and second level too. And I think if we think about how learners start their numeracy journey, at the early stages of learning about numeracy and maths, children are used to counting concrete items. So in the example that we've got there on screen, 1, 2, 3, 4 pencils, and they're very used to counting physical things. But then when we move on to working with time, we're asking them to count something that is abstract. They can't touch time, and so that in itself can be challenging for some learners.
We also know that learners are used to counting from 0 or from 1. And when working with time, we're asking them to then start counting from 12. And we're telling them that after 12, we move on to 1 again. So again, that can be quite a tricky concept for some learners to get their head around. Another issue is that each number on the clock can have different meanings. So for example, a 4 on the analog clock can mean 4 o'clock. It can mean 1600 hours, but it can also represent 20 past. And also when we think about what they count in, and I noticed that somebody's posted that in the chat, 60 and 24 are not numbers that we normally associate when we think about, friendly numbers or number bonds or common numbers. Learners are not as familiar with their number bonds to 60 in the way that they are with number bonds to 10 or number bonds to 20. And as learners begin calculating time durations, they really need to have confidence in their number bonds to 60. And as somebody also mentioned in the chat, time involves a lot of work with fractions, and this can often be a challenging concept in itself. In order to tell the time, learners need to have that secure understanding of half and quarter, and it really relies on a firm understanding, which if there are gaps in fractions, that then automatically leads on to gaps in time. So as we go on, we're going to have a look first of all at early level, and then we will focus on the different aspects and how time progresses through the curriculum. So we are going to have a look at the spaces, the interactions and experiences that we offer at early level. First of all, when we think about spaces, we want them to be numeracy rich. We want them to have that mathematical language, resources and books that are related to all aspects of numeracy. But when we're thinking carefully about time and what our spaces might look like in relation to developing that concept of time, it might be that we have things like timers, small clocks, stopwatches, calendars, opening and closing times on the shop or on the post office. We might have old timing devices available that learners can tinker with to kind of encourage that curiosity, encouraging them to take it apart and have a look at how it works and all the different bits of the devices. We also would hope to have a range of different calendars, charts and diaries available so that these can spark curiosity, but they can also encourage playful interactions as learners begin to use them, for example, in their role play or in different situations throughout the setting. It might also be appropriate to have a visual timetable which can illustrate concepts such as now and next. They can support learners to sequence events in chronological order because it encourages the language like before and after, next, today, tomorrow, later, and it gives that visual clue which makes it a bit easier for learners to recall, when did things take place when they're building that picture up. And also, we should take the time to consider how can we take advantage of what is available in our outdoor spaces to explore and experience time and seasons in different ways as well. Now, we've used the next slide in all of the presentations, but really for the reason for us to kind of keep going back to this is highlighting the importance of the questions I wonder. And what do you notice? These types of open-ended questions are so important because they empower learners to take charge of their learning, and they're not just suitable at early level. We know that practitioners are using these prompts throughout the school, and we will take a look at how to use some of the I wonder questions in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. We also want to point out a couple of misconceptions that we can sometimes use that, totally unintentionally, that do end up causing misconceptions. So things like, oh, be there in a minute, can be confusing when actually you don't mean 1 minute, you mean 5 minutes. And I know myself, as I began to think about this, I was terrible for saying, I'll be there in a wee minute, give me a wee minute. And when I think about it, what do I even mean, a wee minute? And so it's kind of thinking about the language that you are using as a practitioner, and also other adults in the school they are using, making sure that we aren't our language isn't causing misconceptions. We need to model language as much as possible, and making sure that these simple phrases don't slip out. So as you go through the next few days, try and kind of catch yourself. Are you using any of them? Can you address it? Because again, it's a very small minor change that actually can help to make quite a big difference in terms of understanding. So as I mentioned, we talk a lot about the phrase "I wonder," and here we've got some examples of how we could use this in order to develop an understanding and an interest in time. So things like, I wonder if we can tidy up before the timer runs out, or I wonder what you did before we stopped for snack, or I wonder what you're going to do after we finish the story. The language that we're using here is really important. It's important that we're trying to embed that within our everyday conversations with learners as much as possible. And that might also be modelling things like we're going to have lunch at 1 o'clock, we're going to go to the gym hall in 1 hour. We're just emphasising that every day in all of our interactions and our regular routines that we're having with learners. And also taking the time to model language as much as possible. So in daily conversation, we're trying to pick up on using these words explicitly. So, first we're going to have a story, and then later on we're going to do some art. Or, this morning we're going to be looking at our new sound, and in the afternoon Mrs. Smith is going to be coming to do some science with us. Again, just kind of embedding that explicitly so that we're giving children that real life experience of how these words are used. When we think about the different experiences, again, it's important to think about that wide range of experiences that help to develop an understanding of time. And this might include taking the time to explore the presence of clocks and timetables in your immediate area and community. So the real life contexts are also really helpful. You can use books to explore that, and also real life concepts. At early level, they might not have had an understanding and an experience of all of these things. They might never have travelled to the train station. They might not have done baking at home, those kind of things. But it's actually about how we can build these into discussion and how we can give learners experiences and just kind of show how they are really important. It's also important that kind of multi-sensory approach, exploring the seasons. Again, seasons is quite an abstract concept. So learners really benefit from getting outside, crunching through leaves in autumn, playing in the snow. And if we think about the key messages from Realising the Ambition, it really highlights the importance of children being outdoors, experiencing all weathers and seasons in appropriate clothing, helping them to develop that sense of wonder. We know that some settings have used photographs of these experiences to help build up a display. And then these can be referred to periodically, comparisons over time. If you've got, for example, a tree in your playground, what does it look like in January, taking a photo and putting it up there? What does it look like in May? Regular visits to it, regular photographs, showing that opportunity to kind of reflect and also to make predictions about what might happen next, what might it look like in our next photograph. And a good idea is to provide learners with opportunities to make observations over time, things like their height on a height chart, watching an ice cube melt, keeping a record of the different weather, planting seeds and watching them grow so that they get that concept of time passing and things changing. And also we know that lots of learners love a challenge, and timers can be really good in kind of promoting this. So you can give them different challenges. How many star jumps can you do before the timer runs out, or how many times can you write your name? They might come up with their own challenges, and increase the amount of things that they want to do in order to achieve the time. And that's kind of some of the ways that you can encourage them to build it into their own interactions and experiences as well. As we move on to some of the more kind of formal things that are taught at early level, things like days of the week and months of the year, again, a few simple tweaks that we make can actually have quite a big difference. So if you're displaying the days of the week, it can be a good idea to display these in a circle rather than vertically or in a horizontal line. And that just reinforces the concept that time continues and it continues to repeat. You might also have opportunities where you, for example, have 7 children that are standing in a line and they all have a board or a piece of paper with a day of the week. And then the rest of the class have to give them instructions to put them in order, or they might arrange themselves in a circle so that you can then go on to ask questions, you know, oh, I wonder what day would be between Wednesday and Friday, or I wonder which day comes after Monday, these kind of questions. And it's the kind of thing that also can be adapted when you're exploring months of the year and relating it to seasons, you know, thinking about when it's winter, you know, which season is that. Similar when we think about the kind of days of the week, the months of the year, we can often see those displayed vertically or horizontally, but actually if you do display those in that circular model, you know, in this example, it's like a birthday chart, which can make it relevant to learners. You can again use questioning and make this an interactive display. So, you know, I wonder which month has got the most birthdays, what do you notice, so that it's not just something that's up on the wall and never really referred to. I think it's important we always kind of note this point that obviously your own settings, you will be aware whether it's appropriate or not. You know, in some settings birthdays are not celebrated, but if you can't have the likes of a birthday display up, you might still consider how you could display the months of the year in that circular way. So using a birthday display, that's one of the ways that we can help learners to explore time. Also, things like a weather chart and class calendars are a really good way of promoting this. So considering the different questions that we could use to promote the understanding and the associated language, we've included some examples on the slide. So, you know, which is the warmest month? What's your favourite day of the month or day of the week? Why? What days are you at school? What days are you not? That kind of thing. You know, and we spend a good bit of time looking at the calendar and kind of making sure that they do understand that. And then when we think about early level, we also have a few specific time concepts that we introduce. And one of those is that introduction to the concept of o'clock. So when we think about how we actually are teaching o'clock, we need to make sure that learners understand the link between the numbers that they use and the numbers that they're used to using, and then how that relates to the numbers on the clock. So in this example, we've laid out post-it notes in a straight line, and we might say to learners, if you were to pick 4 o'clock, which number would you pick? 5 o'clock. So that they're beginning to understand that 5 o'clock is linked to that number 5 that they're familiar with. And we could go and extend that on to, well, what would it be an hour earlier, or what would it be 1 hour later? And then we might ask them to come back to 12 o'clock and talk about the fact that it doesn't then go on to 13 o'clock. And at this point, we may well move the post-it notes into that circle so that they can understand why after 12 o'clock it moves on to 1. And learners can watch as the post-it notes are arranged in that circle. And then you can show examples of real life clock faces alongside it so that they can help to see the link between what you've just shown them being modelled and the clocks that they will see you know, hanging up in the classroom, in the dinner hall and things like that. Now, you might consider only introducing an hour hand without the minute hand on the clock first of all. You know, and so they get used to that idea as they were with the number line. You know, they might stand in the middle of the circle and point to the correct number. So if it's 1 o'clock, where will they point? And then when they're comfortable with that, you're then thinking about introducing the minute hand. So you've got one learner who maybe stays at the top as the minute hand, and you've got one as the hour hand. And again, you're using questioning, you know, what do they notice? What do they notice about that minute hand? What do they notice about the hour hand? You know, one is always pointing to the 12 when we say o'clock. And there's also lots of online manipulative teaching clocks. So the one that's on the screen there comes from Toy Theatre. And if you are using any that you've kind of used in the in your classrooms, please do feel free to share those in the chat as well, and people can take a note of those ones. Now, there is a bit of a debate going on about whether we should be teaching analogue time at all anymore. We know that we live in a very digital world. When we think about phones and computers and electrical appliances, it's becoming less and less common to see an analogue clock hung on the wall. And even things like people wearing analogue watches now is becoming less and less common. But actually, when we think about how we learn to tell the time and how we really understand time, the analogue clock still has its place for helping learners to understand how the numbers in time are represented. And that constantly moving hand helps children to build up that sense of the passage of time. And the numbers on the clock face help learners to block into that 5-minute interval that we're used to telling the time with. The clock face, it also provides that visual picture of the current time. And we can see how close it is to the hour and past the hour and what hour is going to be next. And again, that's a really important concept for learners to kind of get to grips with. So they can see that passage of time, they know what's coming up, whereas the likes of a digital clock, it only displays what time it is now. And so that's why it's really important. And I think, we do have this debate. A lot of people come up to us and, they have conversations with us about they feel that they should teach digital time first. But I think, again, in that slide that we were talking about previously, where it shows the link to the number line and how that then builds up into the circular face, it is really important that we are still teaching with analogue time. It also means that as we go on to time duration, things like 10 past, it's easier for learners to actually see the fraction of the hour in that circle. And later when they then begin to talk about things like 10 to the hour, they can then begin to kind of see the link on that circular shape. And essentially, although analogue might still be quite abstract, it does provide a visual clue in the way that digital doesn't. So something to consider is perhaps that digital time only shows you the present time, and that there definitely is a place for that. Now, when we think about some of the other kind of ways that we can teach the introduction and some of the different experiences that we can give, we know that games are a really good way of reinforcing that concept of time and, can make it quite fun. So games, these can be used at all different levels and adapted. Some establishments, you might already have games in your maths cupboard that are time specific, so it's always worth kind of checking out what your school does have available. And the bottom images, these are taken from a site called Mrs. Giraffe. There's lots of ideas on there that you can print out and laminate and kind of use. And also a couple of the websites, again, these have got good links for all levels. You need to select what's appropriate, obviously, for your learners, but most of the games have got multiple levels that can be used right the way through from early to 4th level. Now, we are going to, you've listened to me talk quite a bit there, so we are going to stop for a little screen break here, I think, aren't we, Jacqueline? Is that the next one?
Yep.
Yep. So we will, what time should we come back at, Jacqueline?
Apologies, sorry, somebody was emailing me there to say, can they have the link? 4:30.
That's great. So there's a little task there, so you can get up, have a stretch of legs and things like that. But a question for you to consider there about why is the clock circular in shape? So we'll leave that there. We'll pause for a minute and we'll come back at past. So that's us just at past there. So just before I pass over to Jacqueline, who will talk a little bit more about first level, we've got a few people who have quite rightly commented in the chat that obviously sundials, they were one of the very first timekeeping devices that were made. You know, the shadows formed by the rays of sun helped people to identify what time of day it was. And so when we're thinking about you know, why is the clock circular? It is important to have that conversation with learners, you know, and also talking about things like hourglasses, water clocks, candle clocks that were used in times gone by. But when we talk about why it is that circular shape, it helps learners to really be able to kind of build up that picture of time in their mind. You know, they begin to think about that passage of time, as somebody says, you know, that round shape never ends, it continues on, and emphasising the idea that, you know, there's 60 minutes in every hour, it moves on to the next hour and it keeps going, and how that then is repeated over 12 days, 12 hours, and then it goes into the 24-hour time, and it continues to pass at that kind of repetitive pattern, which will in turn help to support them to be able to tell the time. And so children should be able to come to the conclusion that if we were to use a time number line, we would be going on forever and ever and ever. So that's why we do display it in that circular form. So I'm going to hand over to Jacqueline now, who will talk a little bit now about that progression into first level.
Okay, thanks everyone. Just a quick reminder that if you've not checked in, I've just put the link into the chat again. It's really just asking for your local authority. It's just for our numbers so we can report on how many attended, etc. So if you could do that, if you've not done it already, that would be appreciated. Thank you. So earlier on, everyone mentioned about saying things like being careful about saying things like I'll be there in a minute or a wee minute, that sort of thing, because that can be confusing and cause some misconceptions. But it is also important to remind ourselves that some learners will have lots of different timing devices in their houses and some will have none at all. What they have will vary depending what background they've come from. So it's really important that we think about that. Again, some learners will have watches, some learners won't have watches. And at the top right hand side, you will see that we've highlighted the phrase back of 6. So what I want you to do just now is just take a moment to type in the chat, what does the back of 6 mean to you? And don't be put off if people are putting other things. What does it mean to you? If somebody said to you, I'll be round at your house at the back of 6, what time would you expect them there? I don't know what it means. I love the honesty. Okay, so this is really interesting. And actually, I've had some polite debates with my own family about what this means, and we all think different things. And I love the honesty of people saying, I've heard it, I don't know what it means. It really is. It's an informal phrase that means something different to other people. And it's important that we know that learners are exposed to this type of language. And actually, even if we are, you know, within my own house here and somebody's saying it's a constant debate in their house, we probably all think of different things. So actually, when it's things like that, they're probably better to be avoided. But we need to know as teachers the kind of experiences and languages that people will be exposed to. And you did test that phrase for that reason. I like it. Yeah, I don't love it either. So we just wanted to kind of point that out. The other thing that we wanted to point out is that some learners will come from families where timekeeping is quite a challenge and it's really difficult. So actually maybe getting to things on time isn't as valuable or isn't as easy for some families as it is for others. And maybe just keeping to time isn't a priority for some. Maybe it is for others. And I think it's really important that we consider that because actually their understanding of time will be affected by this as well. So just keep that in mind, or maybe some slang language or something has been used as well. And I think it's important to kind of investigate, what do they know? What do they hear in their own lives as well? Time can be a really challenging thing to teach. If I'm honest, it's probably one of the hardest things that I found to teach when I was in the class, and I think one of the ways of getting around that is to try and revisit it daily. And probably I found that I maybe avoided it because it was so difficult and they weren't getting it that actually it just made the problem worse. So try and revisit it daily, even if they're not getting it, just by making loud proclamations. You know, it's 6:30, or well, it wouldn't be 6:30 when you're in school, unlikely unless you're there at night. But it's 11:15, or it's lunch will be at 12:35. All that sort of thing. Just keep being very vocal about them. And you'll find that hopefully it'll start to get a wee bit easier for them and for you as well. Okay, what we want you to do now is have a look at this calendar. So this is the month of June for this year. And just what do you notice about the month of June? Type it in the chat. Anything that you notice, absolutely anything. I'll give you a moment or two to do that. I'm just laughing at all these comments in the chat about the back of 6. It is hilarious. Okay, good. Something's coming in. 1st June, the Wednesday. It's 30 days. There's no numbers in the first 3 days. That's a good point. And I wonder why. That might be something that some of the learners might say. So what do you wonder about? It could be something else you ask as well. Okay, some good things in there. So what we like about this kind of activity is it's a bit more open, and you'll know from all the other sessions that we've been to, that you've been to before, if you've been along to any, that we try to look at tasks and see how we can open them and make them a bit more accessible to people. So typically what we might see is that learners are given a calendar, or they're given an excerpt of a calendar or something like that, and they're fired loads of questions. So how many days are there? How many Saturdays are there? How many weeks are there? How many days is it until? That sort of thing. But by asking them what they notice, they've got to really become a bit more engaged with the task, rather than mechanically answering all those questions that actually some of them just won't even know how to get to those answers themselves. So this is quite a good differentiation approach, because most of your learners should be able to make some sort of observation, and some of those observations will be just simple observations. That's fine, they're valued, they've got something to contribute, and some of them may be more complex, and that's also great because learners can learn from each other. Oh, I never noticed that, you're right, that sort of thing. So we really like this kind of task for that. So just that, and you'll hear us, we bang on about it all the time. What do you notice? What do you wonder? But it can be applied to almost anything as well. What you could do, if you wanted to carry out this as an assessment, is that learners could pick a month of a calendar, and they could note down all the things that they know about that month. And in terms of differentiating, some learners might need a wee bit more scaffolding with that, some might not. But if you're using that what do you notice approach, then actually less scaffolding should hopefully be needed with that as well. So these are just some of the things at first level that we're going to kind of look at today. There's quite a lot. I've got to say, when we pulled together the time presentation, it was probably the most complex presentation, because it is such a difficult concept for learners and teachers. You know, even more so than fractions, and when we came to pull it together, because there's so many nuances and difficulties. So hopefully we can kind of explore some of them. We're not going to solve all your problems today, but hopefully we can just help you when you next come to cover time, which will be tomorrow, because you'll obviously be referencing it daily from now on, of course. So learners, first of all, should be able to order the days of the week, as Yvonne said earlier on, and then the months of the year. And once they're able to do this, they can then move on to ordering the dates within the same month, followed by dates in different months, and then following on from that, random dates and months as well. And that is the kind of way they'll progress through that. If you're finding that there's parts of that they're not able to do, then take a step back, and just by looking at this slide and the kind of order that they do things in, you'll be able to know where to go back to, because if you move on too quickly, it just becomes, again, abstract far too quickly as well. What we also like is that asking learners to order dates can actually generate a good bit of discussion as well. So, for example, in the first one, the days of the week, learners could start at any of the days of the week because they're rolling. So they might start at Thursday and then go to Sunday, Tuesday, and then finally Wednesday. And that wouldn't be wrong because the days are rolling, but it can be linked back to those circular displays that we talked about. If you did want to be a bit more specific and you really wanted them to start Tuesday, then you could say, put these days in the correct order, starting with Tuesday, and that's fine. It's just being very careful about your language and making sure that they know exactly what you're meaning. So a quick task as well. We're challenging your thinking quite a bit tonight, I think. Out of interest, what do you think is the first day of the week? Do you think it's Sunday? Do you think it's Monday? Do you think it's another day? Stick it in the chat. Okay, so there's a majority for Monday here, which actually I wasn't expecting that. So yeah, that's interesting. Well, the answer to this actually depends where you live. In countries such as America, Canada, Japan, and other countries as well, it's actually Monday. And somebody's quite rightly said it depends on religious beliefs, which it does. But here in the UK, the official start of the week is Sunday. And you'll find that even within the UK, there's a lot of disagreement about that. And we're not saying what's right, what's wrong today. We're just kind of opening your eyes to what the debate is out there. So what we would say is double check with your school what their kind of policy is on that. And it might seem like a really small thing, but it's just so that everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet with that, because some people, it's confusing for a learner if they're in primary 1 and the teacher's saying it starts with a Sunday, and they go into primary 5 and the teacher's saying it starts with a Monday. So just making sure that it's a consistent approach, and even have that discussion with them. Well, lots of people believe different things. Yeah, good points in the chat there as well. So just some things to consider. Another thing is that makes it a bit more complex as well is there's so many different ways that calendars can be laid out, and really it's a good idea to try and expose learners to different types of calendars. So these might be annual, monthly, weekly, daily, but also printed in lots of different formats as well. So even weekly calendars can differ in the way that they're laid out, so just lots of exposure, and hopefully at early level they've had a chance to play about and just use them, as Yvonne said earlier, in their role play, things like that as well. It's just embedding that into what they're using. It really is important as well that we link calendar activities to real life events as much as possible. The textbooks have got lots of calendars and lots of questions, but they're not actually linked to the life of the learners. And that's not to say don't use them. That's like absolutely not what we're saying. But where possible, if you can try and embed it into their own lives and things that are relevant to them, then the more relevant it is, the more engaged they're likely to be as well. Things that you can use are blank timetables, blank diary pages, maybe online calendars. And as they progress through the levels, the use of digital calendars will become a bit more normal. I know that my own children are in secondary and everything's on Teams or it's in Google Classrooms, and they've got to access the calendars and things through that, due dates, all of that. So as they progress, it does get more complex as well. They could use these calendars that they're using to plan out different events, and some of you will be doing this already. So school holidays, birthdays, trips, assemblies, parent council events, loads, anything that you can think of. You could have one big class calendar that everybody can see and everybody can access. It might be that you've got birthdays and things like that. Again, it's up to you and your context as well. Some schools have got homework diaries, which sometimes are just left in the bottom of the bags or lost, which is not the best use of them, but the reality is we know what happens. But if these diaries are used and referred to regularly, then they can really help develop that concept of time as well. Okay, so the other thing, and just another layer of complexity, is that dates can be written in a variety of ways. And it is really important that we explore that with our learners as well. And it's worth having a discussion about why we write the date in different ways. Sometimes this might be down to formality, and other times it's just down to personal choice as well. I remember when I was teaching, and even when I was at school, in your literacy jotter, you wrote the full date out. In your maths jotter, you wrote the short date out. And actually, like, why? Is that because that's words and that's numbers? It just, like, if you actually stop and think about some of the things you do and why you do it, it's good to question that every now and then. But again, it's down to personal choice here as well. It might also be worth exploring the different ways that countries record the date compared to how we do it in the UK. So if you think about a lot of the TV shows that the children that we've got in front of us watch, then actually they're American, and the Americans say the date slightly different from us. So, we would say Monday the 5th of July, they would say the July the 5th, so they'd put the month before the date. And although, again, it seems like a small thing, it can cause a bit of confusion, even with adults. Like, I know this year I'm looking to go on holiday to America, hopefully, fingers crossed. And even just looking at dates, it can be confusing. What is that? And I've seen a few people posting things that I'm one of these Facebook groups that posts about events that they're going to and things like that. I'm like, when is that? What month is that? And I have to think about what it is, because they've actually written things round a different way from what I'm used to. So it's just worth being aware of that, really. So moving on to the clock. Earlier in the session, when Yvonne was talking about introducing o'clock, we asked you to consider only using the hour hand. And this was really just because that's what research is kind of pointing us in the direction that it makes it easier for learners to take in. But it can also be used when introducing half past as well. So same number line as earlier, we've got a written one here, we've got the post-it note. So I would start off with the post-it note, get them to lay out whatever you want, and then just focus, you know, a bit of revision, show me 4 o'clock, show me 7 o'clock, so on. Then what you could do is point halfway in between two numbers. So in this case, we've pointed halfway in between the 4 and the 5. Oh, I wonder what time this might be. And have that discussion with learners. And then what you're trying to get across to them, that this is halfway between. So actually it's 4:30 because it's gone past the 4. It's not at the 5 yet, but it's 4:30, halfway between the 4 and the 5. And lots of activities like this. Once they're comfortable with that, you could then arrange them into the clock face again. But you can also have number lines and clock faces together so that they can see those links visually as well. And then you would just use the arrow again to point. So this time it's halfway between the 4 and the 5. So what does that mean? Well, on our number line, it meant 4:30. And on this clock face, it means 4:30 as well. And once they're secure with that, then you can introduce the minute hand again. But this time explaining when we see 4:30, that the minute hand always points to the number 6. And they might wonder why. So what you can do is you can fold over clock faces. Paper plates are quite good for that. And it's showing that link between 12 and 6. So you could say something like, how many numbers do you see in the clock? 12. What is half of 12? Half of 12 is 6. And when we see the minute hand pointing to the 6, then that time will always be 4:30. But you've got, it's really helpful to do lots of practical activities using things like paper plates and things like that as well. And once they've got a good understanding of that, you can introduce the digital 4:30 and the digital time. And again, going back to those games that Yvonne mentioned earlier, Snap, Dominoes, Matching Pairs, Bingo, and all those online links, they're really useful in helping the learners make that link between the digital and the analogue. And actually we could spend a full session on those links, but we've got so much to cover that we just don't quite have time to do that today. Understanding of quarters is really important, and actually I'm saying that about the digital. We could spend a full session on 2:45 and 4:15. I know for me it was one of the most challenging things of time, and I think it's when I came to teach 2:45 I probably hit my biggest stumble that I'd come across in teaching, because it was really hard. However, we don't portray that to the class. You know, that's you'll get there. You might not know it now, but you're going to get there. And as long as they don't think that we're seeing it negatively, then there's less chance that they'll see it negatively as well. So quarters is so important. If they don't have an understanding of, if they're not confident with quarters, then they're really not going to find this easy at all. So if they're not confident with quarters, you'll need to go back and reinforce this concept with them as well. And if we go back to the paper plate example, this time we could fold the plate into quarters. And what I would do is do that by halving and halving it again, because that's how we would introduce a link between quarters and halves and one whole. So how many equal parts do we have? We've got 4 equal parts. And this means that the clock has been split into quarters. So you can see how it links. And using a number line and splitting the divisions as well can also be a good approach with them. So you can see here that we've got the equal parts in there in between the numbers. And in this case, we're pointing between the 7 and the 8, but it's not halfway. So what is that? Well, it's actually 7 1/4. So what does that mean then? And it's just lots of activities like this. Bar models can also be helpful. So we know that the whole is 1 hour. How many minutes is that? It's 60. If we split that into 4 equal parts, then we've got 15 minutes in each equal part as well. And I think sometimes we can skip too quickly to try and use the clocks, but actually lots of, it's almost reinforcing number here is what you're trying to do as well, and getting those facts, those number facts kind of embedded in so that they've got quick recall when it comes to telling the time as well. What we would say is focus purely on the analogue to begin with, just because if you switch to the digital too quickly, it will just overwhelm them, and it's really quite challenging. Going back to the paper plates example, if the minute hand is pointing to the 3 for 1/4, what might this be if it's 1/4 when you're ready to move on to the 1/4? And lots of practice and daily revisiting it. We can't overemphasize how important that is. But once the learners are comfortable with using the analogue clock, then you could introduce the digital. And again, you should just go back to those paper plates example that you can see in the images here. And as I said, we could really spend so long on this, but if you take away anything from this, it's to start with the analog for each unit of time and then move on to the digital, but take it slow and revisit it often as well. So yeah, we could spend much more time in that, but we just don't have that time today, unfortunately. So once you have introduced all the concepts, you can assess learners by asking them to sort the clocks under the different headings and making sure that there's a range of them. So some digital, some analog, you know, quarter past, quarter to, half past, o'clock, all of that sort of thing, really mixing it up. And it's a good assessment activity because it'll show you what they can understand. But it's if you can observe them doing this, how quickly can they do it? Is there any hesitancy? That sort of thing. Okay, so when we do move on to teaching about minutes, it's really important that we provide time to explore how long 1 minute actually is. And again, sometimes we can kind of overlook this part. Earlier on, Yvonne talked about using the sand timer, but now we're looking to officially introduce 1 minute. And what you can do is ask them to carry out various activities within 1 minute. You might ask them to stand up when they think 1 minute is over. They could see how high they could build a tower in 1 minute, or how many items they can draw, or how many times they can write a word. But also let them create their own 1 minute challenges as well, because they can have fun doing that. And there's no reason why they shouldn't have a bit of fun in trying to kind of learn a particular concept. So we're going to try one now. Let me just get the timer on my phone. What I want you to do is, before you do the activity, I want you to estimate first. So I want you to estimate how many triangles do you think you can draw in 1 minute. And once you've estimated it, stick it in the chat. Just a rough estimate. Now, I actually did this earlier to see how many I managed. Okay, so we've got quite a mix there. And again, it depends how fast you go as well. So what I want you to do is all get ready. Get a piece of paper and a pencil or pen close by. And I'm going to set the timer in just a moment. Okay, get ready. I know some can't do this, so don't worry. Get ready. 1 minute starting now. This is where 1 minute starts to feel like a really long time. 25 seconds left. I wish I could see people scribbling away right now. It'd be hilarious. Ten seconds. Okay, and that's time. Stop. Stick in the chat what you managed to get. For me, it was 6 to 8. They weren't particularly neat triangles, I will say. And when I went back to count, I really wish that I had put them in nice rows of 10, which I didn't. It made it harder to count. So I'm scribbling really fast. Brilliant. Okay. The reason we did this is because it's really important that we provide those opportunities to estimate before carrying out a task, and really not just in time and any number of activities. The more opportunities we can and wider measure anything, the more opportunities we can provide learners to estimate, the better they become at it as well. So it really also helps them to develop their understanding of the concept that you're working on. In this particular time, it's time. Another thing that can be helpful in helping them develop that understanding of what 1 minute actually is some tidy up countdown songs. Some will be 1 minute, some might be longer, but let them know what time it is. And there's loads of these on YouTube. Some of you might be using them already as well. You could also then extend this a wee bit further by saying what might take longer than 1 minute, and what things do we do in our lives that might take less than 1 minute. And we'll come on to a wee bit more of that in a second. But you can see now why we were making such a point earlier on of saying I'll be be with you in a minute, or I'll be there in a wee minute, how that can start to cause those misconceptions. So that's why we really do champion not saying things like that. And even I'm going to be honest, it still slips in every now and then to me as well. Okay, so earlier on we also mentioned the Miss Giraffe blog. And here are some further examples of activities that can help develop an awareness of time. In the first example here, learners are sorting images of activities under the correct heading of what they can do in 1 second, 1 minute and 1 hour. The second activity is a bit more open and it allows that kind of personalisation, so learners can start to think about their own lives and what they can do in 1 minute, try them out, that sort of thing as well. Learners should also work towards being able to identify the most appropriate measure of time. So, for example, should we measure what we're doing in seconds, minutes, hours, days, or weeks? And opportunities to talk about the different activities that they've taken part in, both in and out of school, can really help to develop this skill as well. And also timing things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis so they can start to develop that deeper understanding. So in this activity slide, learners have been given a range of things that could happen over a period of time, and they've been asked to place them under the most appropriate unit of measurement. They could also be encouraged to make up their own and share these with the class. Some of the activities might be a bit debatable because they might differ from child to child, and that can make a really interesting discussion. So for example, how long it takes you to brush your teeth. What would the answer to that be? So if I asked you, which one would you use to measure how long you brush your teeth for, what would you put? Just stick it in the chat. So I would say minutes. However, we do know that there are some learners that the reality is it's seconds. My own children are guilty of it sometimes, of running out the house quickly before school, and it really has been seconds, and it shouldn't be. But it's good to have that discussion, bringing in a bit of health and wellbeing here. Why should it be minutes and all that sort of stuff as well? What about measuring the length of time until the summer holidays? What would be the appropriate measure at the moment? We're now on the 2nd of February, so months. And it does depend on how far away it is. That's the point I'm going to come to, which is good. So at the moment, months is probably better. But the closer we get, we might want to start measuring it in weeks, or we might start to want to measure it in days. But I do appreciate that there's probably some of you that are actually already counting the days down already. Fair enough. So the next activity that we're going to look at, it's to really begin to introduce the concept of AM and PM, but not formally at the moment. Learners have to sort typical daily activities into ones that happen before lunch and ones that happen after lunch. So this is the kind of introduction to beginning to think about AM and PM. There's some really good discussions that might arise from that. For example, the brushing the teeth discussion that we had earlier, that we talked about in the previous slide. Some will do it in the morning. Some will also do it at bedtime, possibly even after lunch as well. So actually there's some things that could go in both places. But we also need to be really sensitive to the fact that routines aren't in place for all learners, and just be mindful that something such as breakfast might not be an option or something that all learners are getting on a regular basis. So we just need to kind of be sensitive to that as well. So if we move it on and we actually think about the formal introduction of AM and PM, again, a number line is great. And I honestly did not think of using number lines when I was back in class, and it kind of blew my mind a wee bit, and I really wish I had known. And you know, if I was to go back in now, I would teach time completely differently to the way I did. But a number line can be really useful when it comes to this as well. So this one here has been taken from the Maths is Fun website. You could make your own. It's just to show you what it might look like. This one has the 24-hour clock. Potentially it's probably better to leave that out at the moment, but it depends on the order. If you've already taught 24-hour time, then you might want to keep it in. It's up to you. I think probably keep it as less complicated as possible to begin with. But when we are introducing the terms AM and PM, then it is important that we discuss what they mean. Like, why are we using them? We're just plucking these words out of nowhere. No, it actually comes from somewhere. So it's important to talk about that. We have a definition on the slide here, which again comes from the Maths is Fun website, but it's just a little bit of time just to talk about what it is we're using and why is important as well. Once you've introduced the concept of AM and PM, then learners can go back to those sorting activities. So what are the activities we would do AM? What are the activities we would do PM? What are activities that we would do both? in both AM and PM, and then you could actually start to use Venn diagrams. So you're bringing in different areas of maths together as well. And at various points of the day, you could just stop and say, is it AM or is it PM just now? How do we know? And have that quick discussion. Might be if you're lining up to go out, just, sometimes when there's that wee bit of dead time that you're looking to kind of try and fill, because we all know that we try to get the maximum learning out of every moment in school. So yeah, that sort of thing is really helpful. When it does come to introducing the 24-hour clock, you could possibly revisit the before lunch and after lunch activities that we mentioned earlier, explaining that before 12 noon the numbers are below 12 and after 12 noon the numbers will be larger than 12. So again, we've got the number line here. You could use the post-its, and this time you've got 24. The photograph's cut off a wee bit there, apologies for that. But you could just lay out the post-its the way that we did before, have the numbers 1 to 12 in one colour and the numbers 13 to 24 in a different colour. Lay them out, then you could put them into a circle again, so put the numbers 1 to 12 inside and the numbers 13 to 24 on the outside. The picture on the left is drawn. You could do that with hoops and chalk outside if you wanted to, and it's just trying to make those links and how all the numbers are related to each other. Paper plates can also be very useful. These are just what paper plates that are on top of each other. So the top have the AM, and underneath the wee flaps, each number has a wee flap. It's got the PM equivalent, so it's quite good, to the 24-hour equivalent. So it's good to have a wee look at them as well. But essentially what you're looking for learners to know is that the day is split equally into two parts, AM and PM. And this is a really good opportunity to discuss language such as midnight and midday with them as well. And then again, lots of matching games are really important. Can't overemphasize, you can't overdo them really. So I've been talking for a long time. You will be fed up with hearing my voice. I'm going to hand you over to Maria now.
Thank you, Jacqueline. So we're going to move on just now to consider the teaching and learning approaches that are relevant more to second level learners. And learners should learn how many seconds are in an hour, how many minutes in an hour, and how many hours there are in a day. And as with all the sessions that we've had before, we like to give some practical and hands-on activities and ensure that they are visual for the learners. So you'll see in the example on the slide that's coming up just now, in this example, learners have been asked to create a line of 60 cubes, with each 5 being a different colour. The bottom part has been marked 1 to 12. And the top part has been marked in 5s. And using this as a number line, taking time with the learners to practice that counting forwards and counting backwards in 5s. We know that that's a really important skill that the learners need to have perfected so that they can move on in their learning effectively. We can move on then and extend that with the learners maybe working with a partner or in small groups and maybe picking a cube that they would like to count up to. So you'll see in the top image there that the learner is counting and pointing, to the number 54. So we would be encouraging and maybe modelling this for learners that we're going to be counting up 5, 10, 15, 20, all the way up to 50. So we're counting up in 5s, but then we're going to count up in 1s from 51 up to 54. And again, working with a partner, just taking turns of pointing to different cubes, but it's about reinforcing and really practicing that counting on in 5s and then potentially the 1s as well. And when they've had a chance to explore that with the cubes, they can then think about bringing it into that circular format, a bit like the post-it notes that we used in the previous examples. So again, we're going to ask learners to mark the numbers 1 to 12 on the clock on the inside so that it replicates a standard clock. And they can then count the number of cubes and start marking on the outside, counting up in 5s. And again, maybe repeating the earlier task of pointing to a cube and counting in 5s and then 1s to find out what number it is. And you'll know your learners best. When you feel learners are comfortable with this, you could then introduce the minute hand. And this could then again move on to introducing both the hour and the minute hand. Learners would look first of all at what hour the hour hand is pointing to or has passed, then look to where the minute hand is pointing to and say how many minutes past that hour. So for example, 23 minutes past 4, 46 minutes past 8. And it's worth mentioning here at this stage, it's probably better to stick just to minutes past and have lots of opportunities for the learners to really show their understanding of this. We could bring in the digital link as well. So when we're thinking about that example of 23 minutes past 4, that would look like 4:23. And we'll come back in a second to think about why that notation is particularly important. And again, learners can then move on to using real clocks. All those games that we spoke about at first level and early level, we're also doing that at second level. So they're matching and they're looking at the digital, the analogue and the written times. Again, sticking with minutes past at this point until we move on and we know that they're confident and comfortable. Again, there's a few websites there that might help. You might be familiar with them already, but definitely worth a look at. The bottom one there has got lots of printable worksheets that you can use, and they have those matching games that we've mentioned already. So in the next slide, we're going to focus a wee bit more on minutes 2. Thank you. So having a clock, as you'll see on the screen just now, marked with minutes 2 and minutes past can be really helpful in supporting this. And we're building incrementally on what learners already know. So we're building on what they know about minutes past. We could be talking about how we've only used minutes past up until now, but when the minute hand is pointing to the left-hand side of the clock, we're going to be thinking about minutes 2 instead of minutes past, because it's moving to the next hour. Again, bringing in some games there if they're working with a partner, where they pick a side of the clock, a part of the clock, and they're going to see whether that represents past or to. So just lots of overlearning almost here through that sort of hands-on practical and in a games approach is really, really helpful. Again, you might want to go back to those interlocking cubes again and practice starting at 60 and counting backwards in 5s and 1s. You might want to encourage learners to see the link between the numbers which are vertically opposite one another when the clock is split into two equal parts, and the numbers on the corresponding side, how do they relate to one another? And again, you might pose that in that I wonder that we've mentioned already. So for example, the 2 and the 10 representing 10 past and 10 to, and the 8 relating to 20 past and 22. But it's ensuring that they understand that they are opposite because they indicate the same duration of time, past the hour or to the hour. And for some learners, the notion of progressing from 47 minutes past 5, for example, might take a little bit of time. And maybe chunking this up and taking small incremental steps would really help the learner piece it together. So again, using the interlocking cubes examples, asking learners to find 47 and then asking, I wonder how many until we reach 50, and then extending that to 55 and then 60, and then adding those smaller time intervals together to reach 13. Not all learners will need that, but it's worth just knowing. You'll know your learners best, and you'll know the learners that might need that bit of reinforcement. So we're using that to reinforce it's 13 minutes until the next hour. In this example, the next hour would be 6. And then getting the learners to see the link between 47 minutes past and 13 minutes to is going to really support that understanding and allowing the learners time to come up with those links. Essentially what we're doing is we're practicing their number bonds here to 60, but in a really practical way. And again, as we've said before, really important that we're giving the learners time to practice this before we move on to the link between analogue and digital. The next slide, I don't know how familiar people are. You might want to post this in the chat if you've used concept cartoons before. I spent a lot of time at university using concept cartoons, and they were actually really, really great. They promoted discussion, they promoted that critical thinking, they promoted the investigation, all those skills that we're really trying to develop in our learners. But I don't know how popular they are now. They've sort of fallen off the radar a little bit, but it's worth going back if you're not familiar with them and Google and get some examples of them, because it allows the learners to really get in amongst what's going on, but it allows practitioners to observe what the learners know or what they don't know, because through that discussion, a lot of those misunderstandings can become quite apparent. They're great fun. They can really improve engagement levels and participation as learners start to share their own viewpoints, and it's that justification. Can you tell me and justify why you think whatever, depending on the choice that they make? And it really starts to remove that stigma of recording, and maybe some learners are not ready to be doing the formal recording of time, but just having that discussion beforehand can be really quite useful. And it's rewarding because what it does is it allows the learners to consider uncertainty and that cognitive conflict. So it really is that opportunity to discuss and justify. So I would recommend you having a look at concept cartoons if you've not already. And I see a few people have said that they have used them before, but maybe not for a while, but they're great. I do love them. I mentioned earlier on about time notation, and we know that there's a variety out there of notations when we're thinking about time. A wee word of caution from us: if you can, try and avoid using single dots between the hours and the minutes, at least when you're initially presenting this to the children, because what they might think is it's a decimal point. So if we can use a colon to separate the hours and the minutes, that will help avoid that confusion. We do know, however, that the children are going to come across this when they're looking at TV schedules, and they'll see that the dot is there. But for us, we're going to try and promote that we're going to use the colon to separate the hours and the minutes. And another word of caution here is just to make sure that learners understand the difference between telling the time and a duration of time. So 1:25 is 25 minutes past 1 o'clock in the afternoon, whereas 1 hour 25 minutes is a measurement of a length of time. We also want to make sure the learners are clear that 1:25 is the length of time after midday. So what we're saying is 1:25 should not be used when we're thinking about a duration of time. When we're recording durations of time, it should be in with reference to hours and minutes. You'll see that the screenshots that are on the slide at the moment are from Top Marks. I'm sure you'll be quite familiar with Top Marks. There's a really nice interactive clock on Top Marks that can be used and help with that teaching of time. And there are others, and you'll be using them and maybe quite familiar with some others. We're going to look in the next slide or two about converting time. And the main message that we want to get across in this slide is that it's that providing a range of questions when we're thinking about converting between units of time. So as well as converting between hours and minutes, we should be introducing opportunities for learners to convert months to years, months to days, weeks to months, and I could go on. And you'll see some of them coming up on the slide just now. And again, just the examples that we've put there, we're going to just go through what that might look like in practice, but just be thinking about how much, when we're thinking about time conversions, do we stick really to just converting between hours and minutes, and really we should be extending that a little bit. So in the next slide, it's an example of what that some of those examples might look like in practice. So using a number line to chunk intervals into 12 months and counting this as years. So in the example that we see there, 42 months equates to 3.5 years old. And again, it's just about chunking that up for learners. It keeps it really visual, it keeps it structured, but it also allows the learners to see how the answer has been derived. And when we think about our own learners and they've made a mistake or they've got stuck, and you ask them, right, where do you think you've gone wrong? Quite often they don't know. So what we're trying to do here is just chunk it up so that the learners can maybe identify where they've maybe went wrong. And taking one of the other examples, we can see that this particular one, when we're thinking about 3 months, might have different responses depending on what the learners are choosing. And it's important to allow time for the learners to discuss and investigate this. Again, a really important slide coming up here, and if you've joined us for other presentations, you know that we've spent time focusing on the importance of ensuring learners can partition in lots of different ways. So in the number and number processes input, we looked at all the different ways to partition the number 39. And what we're saying here is we should be providing those same opportunities for learners to approach time activities in the exact same way. We can see from the examples provided how this might help when we're thinking about those questions related to time duration, which can be really quite tricky and difficult for some learners. And you'll see on the slide that we've only listed some of the ways that you can partition, but we know 90 minutes is also 30 and 30 and 15 and 15. So it's about exploring all the different ways and keeping that really open-ended for the learners. And when we're thinking about half an hour or 30 minutes, again, going back to what Jacqueline was saying earlier on, we're reinforcing that to find out 15 minutes, we're going to half. So we're building that link and that relationship between halves and quarters. So if we know 30 minutes is half an hour, we're going to halve that again to find out what is a quarter of an hour. What we're hoping really is that learners at this level can begin to visualise, for example, 90 minutes, that they can visualise that and see all the different representations of this. And we're going to unpick that a wee bit more in the next few slides. Thank you. So this stage, learners should have developed a range of visual and mental strategies on reasoning and fractions that can be reinforced and practiced within that context of time. We've mentioned bar models and number lines. There are other visual representations. These can be really useful when working out how to convert between measures of time in different units. And again, they're not just helping children find the answer, they're helping them explain their thinking and their reasoning, and that's the bit that we're really looking for. And to help children with those mental calculations, they might want to use a blank clock face to count round or call on the range of strategies that they've developed. So some of those strategies that the learners have been using when they're working with number calculations will absolutely be the same or similar strategies that they'll be using when we're thinking about time conversions and time duration. And I've mentioned before, just moving on to the next slide, and I think there was reference to this in the chat earlier on, making links to fractions and making those links really explicit is really important. So posing questions like how many different ways can you work out how many minutes in half an hour? And we can see from the example on the slide, they might skip counting fives until they reach halfway around the clock if they're starting from 12. They might know that there are 60 minutes, so they're going to halve that. Or they might know that there are 60 minutes and they're going to divide that by 2. Again, it's about exploring all those possibilities. And again, can they use what they know about halves to work out quarters in the same way? And you can see from the slide, the image is of a clock face marked to illustrate halves and then quarters. Some learners might need to be shown this practically, again going back to using those paper plates that are cut into a circle, folding it in half and then folding it again to make the quarters. And it's about that hands-on experience that will really support that understanding, because that marks quite nicely on the paper plate, for example, where the half past is, where the quarter past is, and where the quarter to is. And then asking the learners to add the relevant numbers to make those connections, but in a really visual way. So we're going to move on just now to talk a wee bit more about visual representation when we're considering time duration. Again, I've said before, it's really important that these visual representations don't disappear. They're as important for teaching time as they are for addition and subtraction calculations. And again, we want to be reinforcing using that timeline that half past is exactly halfway between an hour or between the hours. And providing those regular reminders for those who need it that half an hour is equal to 30 minutes. It's about that over teaching. Again, we might want to use 1 or 2 number lines and chunk the time intervals into more manageable parts, because that will make it easier for learners to understand what's going on and can reduce the room for error. So depending on the stage and the learner understanding, some learners might need to count up in 1 hour intervals, going from 7 to 8 and then from 8 to 9. They might need to follow these jumps with their finger to keep counts, and others might be able to work out longer time intervals, so going from 7 and doing a big jump to 12 as a chunk of 5 hours, and then adding on the remaining half an hour. The second example on the right uses 2 number lines, and that again keeps that time count as the time spans over night and day. Next slide, Jacqueline, thank you. So again, we're seeing here that some learners, it really depends on your learner understanding. So some learners might be able to do some of these calculations in one step. They might have that visualisation in their mind. Some learners, I've said before, might need to chunk it down because they're maybe not as confident working in half-hour chunks. So they might need to work out, for example, 4:30 to 5, and then record that as 30 minutes, and then adding on that remainder of 15 minutes. So they might need to chunk that up, and the number line can absolutely support with that. In the second example, or the second question there, they might want to add the hours first. So they might want to start at 8:30, add 1 hour to take them to 9:30, and then add on the remaining minutes to work out that the film would finish at 9:45. So it's just about chunking that up to suit your learners, but doing it visually so that they can see where how their answer has been derived. The next example, again, I've said before that time duration can be really tricky for learners, so we're looking at as many ways as we can to make it quite visual and chunking that down so that the calculations might become a wee bit more manageable. And this is one that I've used in the past. Again, it's up to you to decide which learners might need this and which learners might not. Essentially, this example here is similar to using a number line when we're adding and bridging up to that friendly number, so maybe a multiple of 10 or a multiple of 100. What we're working out is starting with the minutes and bridging to the next hour. So in this case, we're adding on 15 minutes. And then we're going to work out the big chunk of hours and finally adding on the remaining minutes. So it just really breaks up the question into those smaller parts and the children can see where their answer has come from. Alternatively, we might want to use the number line and deal with the hours first and then the minutes. We're not saying that there's one way that's right or wrong here, or that there's one way that we prefer. The important message is that the learners are exposed to the variety of approaches and they can then select the most efficient one depending on the calculation that they have. The next slide shows another few examples of using number lines to support understanding. So the really important number lines and working out time intervals, especially if learners have been familiar with using them already when they've been working out number calculations for addition and subtraction. We've said before it's really important to practice their number bonds to 60, and we just want to reinforce that because it absolutely does help. And you might have sort of flashcards to do that with a series of whole numbers less than 60, and the children need to work out mentally what the other quantity is to make 60. All those things that we would be doing in early level where we're looking at our numbered bonds to 10. So when children are calculating time intervals, particularly the more challenging ones, encourage them to employ the range of strategies that they've learned for subtracting numbers. Rather than them asking them to do lots of calculations, which might all be carried out the same way, it's about finding a variety of ways to calculate a smaller number of time intervals. And an empty number line or a timeline can be really helpful here. So we're bridging to the nearest hour in some of these examples. We're counting the whole hours first, which is another valid strategy, a wee bit like a jump strategy when we're thinking about whole numbers. We might want to count past the time and then count back, which is another strategy that learners might use, a wee bit like the kind of over jump strategy. There are lots of other strategies too. And again, it's just really about the learners being given the opportunities to pick the strategy that works with them and giving them that opportunity to reason and justify why that strategy worked for them and why they think it was the most efficient. Okay, again, just one of the areas when we're thinking about second level is considering speed, distance and time. And the reason that we've put the benchmark in, or words from the benchmark up in the top right hand side, is really to emphasise that at this stage, at second level, really what's important and the main focus is on calculating the duration, and it's in that skill of estimating. And you can see from this, from the notes included in the top right, that is exactly what's been taken from the benchmarks. Sometimes when we think about speed, distance and time, we dive in too quickly to the triangle and they're doing all sorts of divisions and calculations. Not right now at second level until we know that the children have got that skill of estimating and that we are focusing on duration. Learners might need to be taught explicitly what MPH means because not all of them will be familiar with it. And looking at the example provided just now, we can think about demonstrating that through that bar model approach as highlighted on the slide just now and chunking that down into those more manageable parts. So working out chunks of 60 miles and then another 60 miles and just building that up until we reach our target of 270 miles. Because when we think about the more traditional way of calculating duration, we would be dividing 270 by 60, which actually is quite tricky for learners and does leave more margin for error. So we're thinking about the bar model and just breaking that up very visually in those incremental steps. Next slide, Jacqueline, thank you. So the history of the measurement of time is really quite a fascinating kind of topic, and it's worth exploring with children at this level. It could be a long-term project that they do. It's one of those, when you think about the kind of physics behind it, it's actually a really difficult time, is really difficult to define, and we've said that a couple of times this evening, but that actually means that it's a really interesting topic that the learners can really get their teeth into. and they can come back and revisit it. There's some links there that might actually give you a starter for 10. There's some links and some videos there that's got lots of information if you were thinking of taking this forward with your learners as part of a kind of IDL type topic. And on the next slide, we have lots more links that we've referred to. Again, you will get access to all of these links. You'll get a PDF, but you'll also get a Padlet. So I know that we've went through quite a lot tonight. I'm going to pass on to Jacqueline just to talk a wee bit more about the Padlet and the recording of the presentation. Thanks.
So the presentation, all previous presentations and slides are on the Padlet, which you can scan using the QR code, or I'll put the link in the chat just now. And the recording, Ian that records this is great, and he usually has that to us very quickly, so we'll add that recording as soon as possible. The slides for tonight are already on it as well, but we do suggest that you use that Padlet, go in, have a look at it if you've not had a chance to look at it yet. It's got everything kind of pulled together in one place. The next session is going to be Introduction to Teaching Data and Analysis, and what we would say is sign up now if you can, because if you go away you might forget, and what we're finding is that some people think they've signed up and they've not, and they forget. If anybody signs up, then I'll send out a reminder email usually a week to a few days before, so that people know that they can how to access it. I'll send out the link, but if you're not on the registration list, you don't get it, which is a shame. So just make sure that you sign up. So just sign up now, and even if you can't make it, don't worry. I would just say sign up now, and the sign up's in the chat there, or you can scan the QR code. But the big thing that we kind of wanted to emphasize today is the regional support, and this is just a drop-in session, or drop-in sessions that are available. There are some of them coming up. I think if there's a couple, the West Partnership and the South East are on the 1st of March, so that's before our next session, and there's a few before our next session. So please have a look. They're optional. You don't need to go. We appreciate that your time is really, really precious, but it's a chance to come along and just ask questions like, oh, I'm about to teach fractions. Can you just remind me of some things, or I really struggled with this, any ideas, that sort of thing. Or even if you just want to come along and talk about maths, it's really informal. You can drop in and out, you can come for 5-10 minutes, you can leave again. It's just something to come along. But even if you can't come along to them, thanks everyone, if you can't come along to them, then join the team. The code's there, and we post reminders of events that are coming up. So for example, I'm responsible, I work with the West. We've got a West conference coming up, so I posted that event in, and people were showing a bit of interest in that. And Yvonne and Maria and our other education officers will post links to events that are happening within your own local area as well. So it's worth joining. And Yvonne very kindly made a nice wee video of how to access that. So we know time's precious. We don't expect you to come if you can't, but it's just in case you just want a wee bit of extra time to explore it. It's worth doing. What we do want you to do is, and you might do it now, you might do it later, but we really want you to think about the session tonight, because what I find is that if I go to a session, I'm like, oh, that's great, and then I go away and forget all about it, and it's difficult to actually embed that within my practice because time's busy. We've got lots that we're juggling, totally get that. But if you stop after the session and you actually think, well, what actually am I going to try and do right away? What's the main thing I've taken away from that session, and what actually do I want to learn a wee bit more about? So it's probably worthwhile if you've got a wee journal or a wee diary or a notepad, just making a note of that. But if anybody wants to post anything in the chat, whether that's a starter, main course or dessert, then please share it with us, because it helps us to see what's been the biggest thing that people have taken away from this. It's just interesting to see. So take a wee moment or two to do that. What I'll do is I'll put the link, I'll leave that up just so you can have a wee look at the dates if you want, and then I'll go back to the link to register as well.